moments for everyone to join, and then we will get going with our session. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to give a few more moments as people are arriving, and we will get going as soon as we have majority of attendees here. Hello, everyone who's just arrived. We're going to give a few more moments for any late arrivals, but we'll be getting going in about a minute's time. Thank you for joining. Okay, right. Well, we will kick off the session. So to deal with the first questions that always come up in these sessions, the session is being recorded, and slides will be made available at the end of the session. Any questions beyond that, please do put them into the chat as we're going through the presentation. My colleague Emily will be facilitating a question and answer session at the end. There will be plenty of time for discussion, so please do post those questions into the chat. So a very warm welcome to this session, which is using data to build equity in early careers programs. I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this along with our partners at Fearless Futures. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Martin Kavanagh. I am the head of assessment at Amberjack, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Rubie Clarke from Fearless Futures. Rubie, if you want to say a quick hello.
Hi folks, my name is Rubie Clarke and I'm Director of Consultancy and Data Solutions over at Fearless Futures. Very pleased to be here with you today.
Great, thank you, Rubie. So we'll just do a really quick introduction into both organisations to explain why we are talking about using data to build equity in early careers programs. For those of you who aren't as familiar with Amberjack, we are absolute experts in early career services, so hence why we're talking and looking at data through that lens. We also offer, as you can see from this slide, a really broad range of services, right through from attraction through to learning and development once you bring your early career talent onto your scheme. So whilst I'm going to be focusing on our services from an assessment perspective, we do offer that end-to-end service, and that means we have unbelievable data sets to use and understand and help us really think about how we get the most out of our early career talent. In terms of from an assessment lens, as an organisation, we focus on assessing for potential. So we believe in a world where individuals in early career talent are hired and progressed based solely on their potential rather than irrelevant things such as past experience or privilege for those entry early career roles. We also see assessment as an extension of attraction. So we believe in telling candidates something meaningful about the roles that they're applying to. But obviously of particular relevance to this session and linked to that view of assessing for potential, we really focus on ensuring diversity and inclusion throughout our processes. We've got specialists in all the areas we support in, but we also know as an organisation there are times that we need to bring specialists in to support us. And one of the things that's been really exciting about working with Fearless Futures is that they have really got us thinking about, well, how do we use the data available to us to get the most out of our campaigns and programs? So I'll hand over to Rubie to give you a little bit more background about Fearless Futures as an organisation.
Thanks so much, Martin. So folks, Fearless Futures, we are DEI experts, and we work with daring companies across sectors who are ready to dismantle inequities by addressing their root causes, their intersections, and the lived realities of inequities in organizational contexts. So we do that through supporting our clients with transformative diversity, equity, and inclusion learning, as well as innovative data solutions and consultancy partnerships. So we have a range of DEI learning that's tailored for different levels of organizational ecosystems. We also collect, analyze, and evaluate data to unlock really deep and rich insights across people, policy, and product. And we partner with our clients to design and implement solutions with our consultancy. So today I'm really excited to talk to you about how we approach diversity, equity, and inclusion data, and what innovative and sophisticated approaches can allow you to do with more robust insights. I'm really excited to talk specifically about the work that we've done in partnership with Amberjack over last year, and what we were able to reveal in terms of their candidate applicant data for 2023.
Great, thank you, Ruby. So in terms of what we will cover, the whole session is going to be looking at best practice in ED&I data management. I am conscious that people will be coming at this webinar from different levels of sophistication of using data, particularly from the thinking about an equity perspective. And as Ruby said, some of the content we'll cover is going to get quite technical and sophisticated. So I'm going to start off with some quite simple practical examples of using data to build equity. So if you're looking for a starting point, that will give you some really good tips on how to think about the data in your early career talent programs. Then Ruby will go on to talking about intersectional data analysis, and we will use that approach of intersection data analysis to really break down some of the trends that we are seeing from recent campaigns in early career recruitment. So I'm going to start off by talking about our approach that we've been using and how it's going to evolve going forwards. So some practical examples of using data to build equity. So in terms of using data effectively, we really use this sort of 3-step process where first of all we monitor performance and identify any issues. We then form some views as to what might be going on, what might be causing those issues if there are any performance issues coming up from the data, and we form what we call a priori hypotheses, which are supported by the data we have and then the academic literature if possible. And then we would really identify and action any changes, and then the loop would start again. So we would start that monitoring performance and identifying issues process again. So one of the things, if you work with Amberjack, you will see these sorts of visuals in any end of campaign processes. And I'd really encourage you to do this as a really simple way of monitoring a selection process. So this can show all of the stages of your process in a flow. And if what you would expect to see is if in this example, 70% of your applicants are male, in a standard process, you would expect, therefore, that 70% of your offers will be to male candidates. If there's a significant drop-off at any point, it could flag something interesting. So in this case, you can see a big drop-off in offer in the male candidates and a big spike in offer in the female candidates. So it could be that there's a positive action campaign that's working in the way it's intended. Of course, in this situation, it could be a case of discrimination in this example, but there is something going on in this data to be explored and understood. And where this is impacting, in particular, minority groups, you really want to understand that issue. So in this example we've got here, we are seeing a disproportionate number of the white candidates progressing through the SJT stage in this process, and we're seeing a drop-off across the ethnic minority candidates. So again, a really clear indication that something needs to happen, and then you would get into a bit more detail about, well, let's look at that data in a bit more with a bit more of a closer lens. So a very, very simplistic way of presenting your candidate flow and seeing when issues exist. And this can be extended to look at a particular process. So this is an example of assessment centre outcomes. And you can see here, if it's highlighted in red, that is showing us the statistically significant difference from what we would typically see. So in this case, you can see that at the assessment centre outcome stage, the black candidates in particular are not progressing at the same rate as the white candidates. You can see that really big drop off. There's a pass rate of 63% in the white candidates and 30% in the black candidates. So something really fundamental to address there. So we then dig into the data, and you can look at this in many different ways. Again, we've got the luxury of having access to the different technology, virtual assessment centre platforms, so we can get really deep into the data and see at the competency level, perhaps. So if we're assessing particular behaviours, are there particular behaviours that are favouring certain groups? In this example, you can see that actually that advantage for white candidates is across the board. So it's not specifically related to the competencies. So perhaps it's related to the individual exercises, and that becomes a bit more interesting. So of the 5 exercises that made up this assessment centre, 4 of them, there's only 3 presented on this slide, but 4 of them were particularly problematic in terms of advantaging the white candidates based on the data we were seeing. So again, we could get in deeper and look at those exercises. Another thing it can be helpful to do is look at, are there any score issues across your assessor pool? So if you've got a large number of candidates coming through a range of assessment centres, is there anything going on in the data that suggests particular assessors are either more lenient markers than you would typically expect to see or harsher markers? And then again, you can break that down to different demographics and see if anything interesting is happening. So we've got some really interesting data there. So what came about from this data analysis is a series of hypotheses about what could be going on, which, as I mentioned earlier, was supported by academic literature. So one of the things we found is that the first exercise that was being used in this assessment centre was creating a stereotype threat in Asian and black candidates. Now, what that means is there's really strong views of how those groups would be expected to behave in that exercise because of how relevant it was to some of their sort of experiences that they would be likely to face. So that increases cognitive load because they're thinking, do I go with that stereotype or go against it? So that creates a complexity in the assessment centre process. Interestingly, in exercise 3, the reverse was the case. So we found in a role play exercise, the situation was so far removed from being relevant for that group that actually they felt unable to empathise effectively with the role players' plight. So 2 slightly different issues to deal with there. For the 4th exercise, we found that actually certain groups are less familiar with these types of exercises. So things to think about in terms of candidate preparation. And there was a specific debrief exercise which brings to life that challenge I was talking about with exercise 1, where there's certain views of how people from certain demographics would be expected to reflect on how they've performed, think about what they might do differently. So it was a very simple piece of analysis. It was quick to do. And what you'll see from these changes is it didn't mean we had to start the assessment centre from scratch. We could make tweaks to the content and identify and action changes that would make a real difference. So we amended some exercise content, and we also thought about the preparation materials and the support we gave to candidates to understand what we would expect from them in those exercises. We changed the topic of the role play, so it presented fewer cultural barriers. We made subtle changes to the assessor script and assessor training to really promote psychological safety in our candidates. We really focused on how we thought about candidate preparation materials and coaching content to get people ready for their experience in the assessment centre. And we focused in on running calibration sessions during our assessor training activities, so we could be sure that all of our assessors were scoring from a similar frame of reference. So this is the approach that we have always historically taken, and you can see that this has really, really positive impacts. So those adverse impact data I was showing earlier, where there was that big difference in conversion rates between white candidates and other groups, we didn't see that anymore. And actually, all of the candidates were progressing at a proportionate rate. And that meant a huge increase in the percentage of offers, which far exceeded sector averages and the national representation. So really positive outcome for this client. And as I said, it was done using quite simple changes based on the data that was available to us. But what I keep saying is that Rubie and the team have said, well, what do we need to do differently? What do we need to think about in the future? And what you'll see as Rubie's talking is there's ways to evolve our approach to thinking about performance through an assessment process to really target our initiatives, target our actions to have the biggest outcome. So I'll hand over to Rubie to talk about the benefits of intersectional data analysis.
Thanks so much, Martin. Really exciting work that you stepped us through there that Amberjack have been doing. So folks, intersectionality is an approach that we can take to diversity, equity and inclusion data, both in terms of collection, but especially in terms of analysis. And it's the approach that we applied to Amberjack's data for candidates, for applicants in 2023. So I'm going to step you through that in a little bit. But to start off with, let's have a look at what exactly I mean when I'm talking about intersectionality. So traditional approaches to DEI data tend to look at and treat factors like gender, race, disability, class as separate, isolated categories. But we know, of course, that in reality, not all women have the same experience. Not all Black folks will have the same experience, and so on. So when we treat, or if we treat gender as separate to race or ethnicity and so on, the question then becomes, how can we understand the experience of Black women? If we treat faith as separate from class, how can we understand the experience and potential barriers for working class Muslims? And importantly, how can we be sure that we are designing solutions that work for those specific candidates? So this is where intersectionality comes in. Rather than analysing race as one factor, gender as another, an intersectional approach looks at these together in order to reveal what specific and importantly, what unique dynamics and potential barriers might exist at the intersection of those. And we see this not just in early careers programs, but in many, many areas, right? We can think about the pay gap. We have data from 2021 that reveals that white British women earn 17% less than white men. For mixed race Black Caribbean women, it's 30% less. For Indian women, it's 20% less, and so on. And so these are really important disparities that ultimately are hidden when we look at data through gender as a standalone lens, for example. So intersectionality, looking at factors together in order to reveal what is specific when these factors come together for folks who live at the intersection. So why is intersectionality important? Let me give you an example. Let's think about an example in reference to early careers, and I'll stick with gender and race here to think about this. So let's say that you want to increase women and ethnic minorities in your organization. And perhaps your data shows you that you get the most women and ethnic minority applicants via university fairs that you attend. What you don't know, because of the data, is that actually all of the women who are coming from fairs are white women, and all of the ethnic minority applicants are perhaps Chinese men and Black men. So Black women and Chinese women aren't actually benefiting from this DEI solution that perhaps you've designed and are indeed investing in. But you don't know that because the analysis is looking at these factors as separate. So because you don't know this, perhaps you're investing resources in the same university fairs this cycle, you run them the same way. And there might be a lot of internal sort of head scratching about why the representation of Black women and Chinese women in your pool of new joiners remains so low. But if you know that your attraction approach isn't working to include Black women and Chinese women, then you can start investigating, how do we improve this? So you might start thinking about, how does our marketing material speak to these potential candidates? How are our representatives engaging with them? So this is why intersectionality is important. Of course, first of all, it's more accurate. A single axis approach, so looking at these factors as separate, ultimately is likely to be painting an inaccurate picture. We're not seeing the full picture. That can lead to investing in our resources into solutions that maybe aren't as effective as they could be or as suitable. And so that analysis gives us the insight we need to design tailored and effective solutions, policies, processes, and interventions. And then finally, it enables us through those solutions to drive holistic inclusion that works for many more people than just perhaps one segment of a target group. The funny thing is, a single axis approach, looking at gender or race or ethnicity as separate, might sound like it's more holistic, right? Because we're kind of zooming in with intersectionality. But what intersectionality shows us is that this approach that I spoke about just there, the single axis approach, it actually tends to only cater to a very small segment of a group. And so in this way, holistic inclusion is something that we can only really achieve through an intersectional approach. So what are the key principles then of this intersectional approach? I'm just going to step us through three briefly. This is the foundation of intersectionality as we practice and apply it at Fearless Futures. First of all, we need a systemic analysis. What does that mean? To do intersectionality, to apply this approach to our data, we need a framework that allows us to be very sure about what categories we're looking at and what categories are less important. So we need clarity. We analyze data on race in relevance to diversity, equity, and inclusion because of how it relates to systemic racism. We analyze data on gender because of how it relates to systemic sexism, homophobia, and so on. So we need a systemic analysis, a framework that says, these are the categories that we're looking at intersectionality, and everything else is not relevant. Secondly, second principle, we're addressing invisibility. So as I mentioned before, we're trying with an intersectional lens to bring to the surface experiences that may otherwise be hidden in our data. And that allows us to drive inclusive change, which is the third key principle. Intersectionality is technical. It's not super straightforward, but it's a very effective approach to ensure that holistic change and inclusion that we know so many employers are committed to and looking for solutions for. Now, I know that many of you will be working within unique parameters, whether it's in terms of budget, of capacity, and so forth. And you might be thinking, well, Ruby, this sounds very sophisticated, very exciting, but is this really doable at my organization right now? And the good news is there are many ways that you can bring this approach into the way that you do diversity, equity, and inclusion that are not necessarily so resource intensive as we may think. Often organizations are actually sitting on really rich pools of data that can be very swiftly analyzed intersectionally to unlock those more robust insights, whether that's from pay data to employee experience data, and indeed to recruitment data and data on some of your early careers programs. And that is exactly what we did with our partnership with Amberjack last year. for their 2023 recruitment insights. So let's have a look at what we learned through this project, this partnership. So we were really excited when we started our partnership with Amberjack to learn just how rich a pool of data was available for us to dig into and explore. We were looking at 300,000 candidate applications for 2023 across 36 sectors. So the way that we went about this was, we always start, when we're doing an intersectional analysis of data, we're always starting with a single axis analysis. So we're always looking at those demographic trends separately first, and then we bring them together using modeling. So there are already some important and revealing insights when we do a single axis analysis. Some positive trends and some not so negative trends. I'll pull out just a couple here. So we saw that women had more positive outcomes than men, which is perhaps not what we expect to see in general. So that was positive. But we also saw that white candidates are substantially more successful than Black candidates and South Asian candidates. Russell Group candidates as well are substantially more successful than non-Russell Group. So positive and negative trends that are insightful, informative, and indeed directive. They give direction in terms of where we might want to focus analysis in terms of early careers. But now I'd like to share with you what we were able to reveal by going a step further, by bringing these pools of data together and looking at the intersection. And I'm going to focus on gender, ethnicity, and university background, because that's where the data was the richest. And of course, I'm aware of time today. So let's start by looking at university background. When we looked at university background of candidate applicants alone, we found that Russell Group candidates came out on top. And this is consistent with previous years. For 2023, Russell Group candidates were 2.5 times more likely to get an offer than non-Russell Group. And then we looked at university background with ethnicity, bringing that data together to see what specific trends might be hiding. And we indeed found some very interesting trends. So what we were able to reveal is that for candidates who had a Russell Group educational background, that all candidates of all ethnic and racial groups received more offers than those without Russell Group education. But interestingly, for candidates who didn't have a Russell Group educational background, there were some very different and specific trends for candidates of different ethnic and racial groups. So we saw that Black students who were non-Russell Group candidates were actually doubly disadvantaged. What I mean by that is they were receiving less than 1% of offers. Similarly, for South Asian candidates, it was less than 2% of offers for those candidates who were non-Russell Group. So when we look at data like this and we reveal these intersectional trends, what does this mean for employers? Well, it means that if we are to focus on strategies to create more access for non-Russell Group candidates, we need to be ensuring that we're really building in an anti-racist element to how we think about that solution. The risk otherwise is that we might end up kind of inadvertently furthering the disadvantage that we're seeing for these non-Russell Group candidates who were Black or South Asian. So it's really about that kind of zooming in to see what's hiding behind the data, which we were able to see here through bringing university and ethnicity together. We also looked at ethnicity as a standalone category. So we took that single axis approach that I mentioned before. Again, white applicants came out on top, and for Black, Arab, and other ethnic groups, they received the lowest offers. And the disparity was certainly the most pronounced between Black and white candidates. As you can see there, white applicants were 2.7 times more likely to receive an offer. We looked at gender also as a standalone. And we found that for cisgender and for cisgender and non-cisgender candidates, we weren't able to reveal specific trends. The data wasn't quite rich enough there. But what we did see is that cisgender women received more offers than cisgender men. So we had ethnicity, we had gender alone. Now, when we brought these together, again, we were able to reveal some specific insights for folks who sit at the intersection of these categories. So when we brought ethnicity and race into our analysis of gender, what we were able to see, and this is a box and whisker graph, don't worry too much about that because I'll step us through what's significant. What we saw is that women who are in blue here receive more offers than men across all ethnicities. But for Black women, this likelihood is actually much, much less significant. So numerically, it's barely significant at all. It's less than a percentage. Now, what does this mean? Again, if we have this analysis, we've dug deep and looked intersectionally, what do employers do on the basis of data like this, right? Well, if we took the single axes analysis here for 2023, we might say, great, our work here for gender is done. Women are having a great time, nothing more to do. Equity for women, tick. Let's focus on anti-racism instead, perhaps. But what this intersectional analysis is showing us is that Black women in particular are still experiencing the lowest or very, very low offer rates. So our solutions from attraction to assessment need some tailoring in order to make sure that we are addressing what those specific barriers may be for Black women here. And that's because of how racism, specifically anti-Blackness and sexism, might be inadvertently playing a role through our processes. And so if we focus on anti-racism alone, or we focus on gender equity alone, we might be missing an opportunity to ensure that solutions, that we design interventions are serving Black women who are clearly facing some specific barriers in processes here. So intersectionality, as I said, it's not super straightforward. I can't pretend that it is. However, it also doesn't, it's a sophisticated approach that can be applied in clever ways that aren't too resource intensive or too daunting, shall we say. So some actions for employers, where might we begin? I have a couple and I know Martin has a couple too. So for me, first of all, I would say if you are keen and excited about the opportunity that intersectionality offers, start by experimenting. Experiment using smaller pools of data. So perhaps look at one of your early careers programs. Maybe there's one that you think that one doesn't seem to quite be working. I think there's some problems there in not attracting a diverse cohort. Focus there, look at the data and experiment with making adjustments in response to any intersectional trends that might emerge through that experiment. Secondly, devise a data framework. DEI data experts can do this. I'm sure we might have some in the room. The only really essential criteria for doing intersectionality in terms of data analysis is having demographic categories, right? When I spoke about a systemic analysis, being really clear on what are important categories for diversity, equity, and inclusion. As long as you've got demographic data, you can look at how to bring it together using some modeling. So devising an intersectional data framework doesn't have to be super complicated if someone's got the data expertise and some DEI expertise, especially if your framework is for one region. A global framework with sort of local specificity, certainly a bit more complex. But if you're sitting there thinking that's exactly what I want to do, then you can, find me afterwards and we can talk through that. But devising your data framework is a really good place to start. Martin, I'll hand over to you for some more action for employers.
Thank you very much, Ruby. Yes, so I suppose the first point I wanted to make, it sounds quite straightforward, but I do see it come up a lot, which is use the data and don't just ignore it. So I'll come on to the next point around solutions don't have to be complicated, but look at data, make sure you're using it. And something I hear all too often is, well, this is a systemic issue that's been going in our process for a long time. We've done all we can, you know, there's nothing more we can do about it. Maybe that's a good point to start looking at some intersectionality and actually saying, this feels like a really big problem that we can't tackle. But actually, if we look at some intersectional data really specifically, maybe there are some smaller groups we can target and see if that has an impact, rather than trying to address the whole group using that single axes approach. And hopefully what I showed before I handed over to Ruby is that solutions don't have to be complicated. You don't have to throw out your entire assessment process and start again if there's an issue in the data. By actually understanding it and thinking deeply about what could be happening, the solutions don't have to be complicated and can have a really positive impact, as we saw in the outcomes there. So that feels like a good point to open up the discussion. Emily, I don't know if you've had any questions coming through to you as we've been talking.
Yeah, I've had a few. So thanks for joining, everybody. There was the first question actually that was sent was around the point of the sort of intersectionality that Ruby revealed around the Russell group versus non-Russell group students, and how those are the non-Russell group, there was a significant disadvantage for certain students and populations of students. So the question was around how and what can be put in place if you reveal that sort of theme or data trend. What can be put in place to really address that and to support those students, I guess, to better outcomes? Yeah,
well, I might kick off on that one actually, because I thought that statistic was, of all of the data we got from the insights output, that statistic around that intersectionality of ethnicity and Russell group or not Russell group was absolutely fascinating. What we have found is a lot of our clients are putting a lot of effort into candidate preparation for assessments, both online assessments and of course face-to-face assessment centres, to make sure that they're fully prepared. What I found interesting about that is often they're done in group sessions, but as a form of positive action, we have a number of clients who have been offering one-to-one sessions for some of the groups they really want to encourage into their organisation. So they're not presenting anything new. They're presenting the same information, but they're targeting it to specific groups. They're making sure they're actively engaging with it in a more sort of one-to-one basis. So thinking about the intersectionality, you can then start to target that a bit more deeply. So you can start to think about, well, who should we be targeting any one-to-one initiatives to that could have a really positive impact? So really thinking about helping people prepare is a really positive way, and using that intersectionality to help. I'm conscious that I would come at it from a very much assessment lens. There's lots you can do throughout the whole pipeline, from attraction through to L&D, but for obvious reasons, the sort of practicing and thinking through the assessment process is where I'm going to have my area of interest. Ruby, I don't know if there's anything you'd add on that question.
Certainly +1 on what you shared, Martin. I mean, there's lots of different areas across the kind of pipeline, as you said. I think when we think about attraction, perhaps digging deeper into what universities are we targeting, and beyond universities, how else are we attracting non-Russell group candidates? What kind of comms and marketing are we doing, and making sure that we are speaking to a really diverse range, and specifically here to Black candidates who we saw are being doubly disadvantaged. And then, as you said, right the way through to L&D, thinking about when it comes to assessments, how are we equipping our assessors to ensure that they feel really confident in kind of being anti-racist in their approach, that they understand the way that may inadvertently feed through their assessment of candidates. So I think it's really that tweaking and tailoring in reference to that deep insight that you have around a specific candidate group.
Thank you both. The next one, I think more specifically at Rubie, is just around building your framework. So, you know, intersectionality sounds fantastic. It's great that you can, you know, we can do this and people are being made of, you know, the way in which it can be done. But as an employer, how do you build your framework? Where do you focus your attention? If you could, yeah, perhaps talk a little bit around that and maybe just how you've done it with other organisations.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an area that we do often help organizations because it's a really important starting point. And if you get that right, it actually enables a very sophisticated approach. But of course, you want to make sure that the framework itself is fully equipped to bring the insights that you need. So as I mentioned earlier, it's about having a systemic analysis. Like when we come to thinking about and practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to be really clear about who we're trying to create solutions for. And so I think it's really important that you have a DEI expert on your team, or outsource it. If you need to outsource it, get a consultant in. It doesn't have to be us, but someone, you know, a contractor or a consultant who has a really sophisticated understanding of who DEI is supposed to serve. Because often, you know, data sets will otherwise be bringing in all sorts of data. You might be looking at geography of candidates. If that's not explicitly connected to a particular kind of inequity, that data shouldn't be included. You know, you could be looking at, I don't know, dietary requirements or favorite football team or anything, and you need to be able to really clearly and consistently drown out the noise. Get clear on who specifically you need to understand the trends for. And from there, it's really about modeling and creating a model that allows you to look at race and gender or faith and class together. But start by being really clear and confident in which categories and demographic identities you need to be analysing at the intersection.
Perfect, thank you. We have a hand up from Craig. Craig, do you want to?
Hey guys, hello. Thank you very much, and my apologies, I was only able to actually join at around about 1 o'clock, so I hope this hasn't already been covered through the slides, which I look forward to receiving. Yeah, totally agree with what I've heard thus far. One thing I wanted to ask about is what emphasis would you put on proportionate representation? So a lot of the time the decision makers tend to be those from the business, so what attention would you put in terms of the training, whether that be unconscious bias or otherwise, preparation, and also having proportionate representation of our communities that we're recruiting into?
I might kick off on that. So it's something I'm really interested in, and there was a big just thinking about the start off with unconscious bias. There was a big drive towards lots of unconscious bias training a few years ago, and there's a really interesting paper by the Equality and Human Rights Commission looking at the effectiveness of unconscious bias training, and what they found is actually sort of tethered and unregulated unconscious bias training can actually be a little bit unhelpful. What you really want to do is provide people with the tools to make sure that and then train them in those tools so they're using it. So in terms of it, you know, we want people in the business involved in those decisions, but what we want to do is make sure those decisions are made in the absolute right way. So one of the things you would have missed me speak about earlier, Craig, is when we're doing assessor training, we do frame of reference training. So we make sure that we're calibrating everyone. And again, we try to calibrate against a range of different candidates from different demographics. And we see in that live training, is everyone using the process as it should be set out and should be followed? And is that resulting in similar scores? And we've got ways of avoiding things like groupthink in those sessions to make sure we're really seeing individual assessors. So my focus, and again, as I was saying, I come from a very much an assessment lens, obviously, but my focus is really on the quality of the materials and making sure that we're following all of the good practice that exists, all the research that exists, to make sure we're doing all we can to support the decision makers, and then monitoring the data once we put those things in place.
Love that, Martin. Can I jump in to add, to build really on what Martin was sharing? I think I would certainly +1 on unconscious bias training. I think you used the word untethered, Martin, which I think is a really good one. often I think one of the big failures is it doesn't offer folks a consistent framework and set of tools for how to practice DEI, and it's much more about sort of ideas of individual acts of bias is sort of the framework. Our approach, and we find this much more effective, is, as you said, Martin, to ensure that people have a shared framework for how to disrupt inequity, both in their own practices, but also to build shared policy and process for assessments and beyond that will enable inclusion. And so I think definitely having tools and frameworks is really, really key. And I think the other thing, one of the risks, I suppose, to be aware of and I don't think it's a bad approach, but something to be aware of in terms of emphasis of diverse interview panels and things like that, is it can create a kind of challenge for folks who maybe feel like if I pass or give good marks to somebody who shares my identity as a marginalized person. So perhaps you have a Muslim woman who's on the panel, and a Muslim woman comes to interview and she thinks this person's great. There may be a kind of hesitancy, is it maybe going to be perceived that I'm actually being biased to this candidate because of our shared identity, rather than the fact that I think this is a really good candidate. And so I think a good way to get around that is to ensure that everyone on the panel has the same frameworks and tools, exactly as Martin said. We often say that policy process, it's only as good as the people who are implementing it. And so making sure that there are shared paradigms is a really, really helpful way to support assessors, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And funnily enough, we have noticed from our data that those that share or belong or identify with the same group actually end up assessing their candidates harsher as a result of that. So it actually ends up being it goes against the candidate. One other thing I also wanted to mention as well, and we operate a strengths-based recruitment process. And with that, one of the things we're noticing to come out of the data, and I'm purely only opening because in the interest of sharing, but in terms of how the energy level, so the plus equals minus element is assessed, what we're noticing, students from certain degree backgrounds or even backgrounds or even cultures and communities may come across in a different way in terms of that energy and enthusiasm, like either be a bit more reserved because of the situation they're in, and ultimately may end up getting scored down for it. So it's a big debate we're having amongst assessors and those that do the offline assessments. Have you got any, because we're currently going through it with Catfinity right now, but is there anything further that you could add as way of insight for helping with that particular process? We provide all the data to we provide guidance and information to candidates, of course we do beforehand, but still we're noticing some really subtle trends for certain groups and communities. So any insights you could provide would be really useful.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, and it links into where we started the session, it's really good that you're looking at that data and thinking about it, Craig. So that's the right starting point. And then if and it sounds like what I was saying, the next stage is to have an a priori hypothesis. If there are certain groups who are going to be disadvantaged by a particular approach, again, is that coming up in one of the things, I don't know if you already do, but any preparation calls, again, particularly focusing on certain groups, and this is our approach to interviewing. This is how we're going to run the interview, and there's always the possibility that actually there could be an alternate format for that, which is exactly designed in the right ways. If the evidence is strong enough and you're still assessing the same behaviours, if that's a genuine thing and there is the disadvantage to those groups, it's shown in the data, it's backed up in the research, then there could be a case for having, as I say, an alternate approach for specific groups. If that's managed in the right way, that could be a good adjustment.
I really like that, Martin. I think the only thing I would add is, if at all possible, look at the data intersectionally. And I think that's, when I think about the particular kind of problem question that you posed, Craig, I think about the way Asian women in particular, for example, are often seen as very reserved, maybe too quiet. That can translate to being perceived as not having leadership qualities. and so on and so forth. And so it can be really, really useful to have that intersectional data to say, is it specifically Asian women, perhaps East Asian women, who are being marked down because of that? And then on the other side, I think having, going through and making that a priori hypothesis, look at training. Is there like a short, sharp training that you could do with the team to help the team feel really equipped to identify what are the specific ideas about particular groups? I mentioned, an idea that we hear in the world about East Asian women. We also know there's very different ideas about Black candidates, maybe being too loud, too aggressive. So having that like rich understanding really sharpens our ability to be able to say, this is maybe where it's playing out to mark those candidates down. So I think use the data, dig into the data, and think about, is there an opportunity to support the team to feel even more advanced in kind of assessing what trends you're finding.
Appreciate that. And it was engagement, and ultimately how that's scored. So you guys, I'm sure, be more than familiar with a strengths-based approach. And so it was the plus equals minus, because it can make a significant difference in terms of quantifiable score. So it was engagement, and ultimately, what we're determining now is that there's many different faces of good. So rather than having the stock answer, so engagement being gregarious, using your hands and all this, and the tone of voice, that's one style of good, arguably, for certain roles. So I think it's been able to come back to the drawing board and determine that good can look good in many, many ways. So there's progress, but I just wanted to bring it up. So apologies if it's been covered. I bet everyone sees that me if it has already, but I appreciate you responding.
Not at all. Thank you for the question, Emily. I'm aware of time. Did we have other questions that came through to you in the chat?
We just had one more, and it sort of relates to the point that Craig raised around targets that are often set at a higher level. We need 50% women, etc., etc. Rubie, from your experience in terms of being able to sort of land an intersectional approach, how you can go about it, how you can engage people to really sort of understand it and get on board with this, because it is complex and it can take time. Could you just give a few sort of, I don't know, pointers around what you've done with other organisations, how they've introduced this to their organisations?
Sure, thank you for this question. So I would say, in terms of getting buy-in, which is often a challenge when it comes to sort of innovating our DEI approaches and solutions, the thing about intersectionality as an approach is it's much more sustainable. It's a much more sustainable way to approach diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to approach the data that we use to drive DEI. And the reason for that is, we know that year on year, employers they communicate how important DEI is and how committed they are to shifting the dial. And yet often the trends are quite consistent. Maybe it moves up a little one year. Okay, women are doing better this year, but then next year, not so much. And there's sort of this like veil over like, what's the answer? Why are we not shifting the dial in the way that we want to? And often the answer to that lies in intersectional analysis. The reason is often that our solutions are only serving certain people that we're targeting. They're only serving certain women. They're only serving certain working class folks. And so it's a much more sustainable way of investing resources to actually have a holistic picture. Now, you may do that and get a set of insights where you say, okay, goodness, we have some work to do. That's okay. You don't have to do it all at once, but at least you know that you can tweak and tailor solutions that create more sustainable change. As Martin said, it's not that you necessarily have to reinvent the wheel. It may be a few tweaks that produce radically different results by being more inclusive. And so we've seen this with employers that we've worked with through recruitment, through identifying that there are specific communities that are being missed, that aren't being served, and saying, okay, your materials aren't really speaking to that community, or actually there's some imagery that's not really communicating a positive message to folks of particular backgrounds. Or actually, we've done a skills assessment, a DEI skills assessment, and revealed that some of the folks involved in recruitment and assessment, they do really well in understanding certain kinds of inequity, but they fall down on other kinds of inequity. So maybe they're really good at understanding sexism and how to disrupt it. And they're quite good at understanding anti-Blackness and how to disrupt that. But when it comes to thinking about the experiences of Black women, there was a kind of drop-off of understanding. And so identifying that and plugging the skills gap and then seeing the shifts in outcomes is really exciting. And that in and of itself, doing experiments like that is an incredible way to get buy-in, because leadership see that and they're like, okay, it works. And so going back to where to start, experiment using smaller pools of data, devise a data framework that allows you to do intersectionality, and yeah, get an example, get some data where you can say, you know, we can see that solutions built this way are much more effective for us.
Perfect. Thank you, Ruby. Martin, do you want to, that's it for the questions. So do you want to finish the session so people can get back?
Thank you, Emily. Just a couple of points. So I said that data that Ruby shared around some of that intersectionality stuff were my real takeaways from our diversity and inclusion insights. But given the folk on the call, lots of people will be very interested. So there is a QR code on the screen for you to get access to our diversity and inclusion focused insights report. And as we keep saying, the slides will also be sent. So don't worry about rushing to get your camera phone out to take a screenshot of that now. You will receive these slides. And Ruby, you have a relevant webinar coming up.
We do indeed. So folks, if this conversation, discussion and presentation was exciting for you and you're thinking about how to recruit equitably and how we do it at Fearless Futures, we are running a webinar next week, so come along. It's been so incredible to work with Amberjack and see the power of, you know, the different approaches that they use, many of which we share and talk about when we're on calls like these, about how important and exciting it is to recruit in equitable ways. And if you want to learn more, come along to our webinar. It's next week, 30th of Jan, 10 a.m. GMT. But as Martin said, you'll get the slides, so no need to take notes. You can have a look when they come to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ruby. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Just wish you a very nice afternoon and thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.